All right. Well, good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and thanks for joining us for another virtual event. And tonight we have Catherine Prendergast with us, and she's going to be talking about her brand new book, The Gilded Edge. Let me get the subtitle correct. Two Audacious Women and the Cyanide Love Triangle That Shook America. And she has a multimedia presentation lined up for us, but I'm going to be monitoring the comments. So if you have questions for Catherine, go ahead and put them in, and I'll be happy to reemerge and ask any questions you might have. So Barbara, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. Wow. You know, the whole true crime thing, the podcast, which in my opinion, podcasts are a reversion to the radio of my childhood, when that was a wonderful way to take in things, has just gone crazy. And I love the fact that this book reminds us that true crime is not a modern phenomenon, but as a matter of fact, has a millennial old tradition. And this one takes us back to California at the turn of the 20th century. And we have lots to talk about. But just so you know who Catherine is, she is a professor of English at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She's also a Guggenheim Fellow and a Fulbright Scholar. I'm so impressed. I'm already feeling inferior here. She's been interviewed by NPR and New York Magazine. She writes about battles over school desegregation, and all kinds of other things, especially the recognition of disability rights. And her previous scholarly books include Buying into English and Literacy and Racial Justice. Now, anybody who knows anything about academia knows that the basic slogan is publish or perish. So, anybody who's going to be successful, especially in your field, obviously has to publish works. But apparently there is some latitude in what you want to write, or do you feel, Catherine, that you are compelled to write nonfiction all the time?
No, I mean, so the first two books would be scholarly monographs that go in libraries, and the main audience for that is scholars in the field and graduate students who are studying. But this is my first book of narrative nonfiction for trade, for the general reader. And the story, when I began to uncover it, I completely shifted and realized this is a story everyone would enjoy. This is not just for scholars. And when I tell you about the incredible events, you'll understand why. But first, I wanted to ask you, Barbara, you mentioned that you have some West Coast background. What do you think of when you think of Carmel and the Monterey Peninsula?
What do I think of? Well, I have to say that when I first encountered it as a refugee from Chicago, the weather, one of the reasons I went to Stanford, in fact, was that experience, the more benign climate. At that time, California was really on the cutting edge. People, there was an enormous glamour to California. People were moving west. Was sort of a Horace Greeley continuation thing. And interestingly enough, Stanford in 1958, which is the year that I entered my freshman class, was not the world-class university that we think of today. And one of the reasons it became so was that they had the gift of enormous amount of land, and land is a theme that we're in development, something we're going to be talking about in Catherine's book, The Gilded Edge. And Stanford was able to raid really great Ivy League professional talent in teaching, not only by offering them a better living wage, but by providing housing, because the university had so much land, they were able to build really gorgeous housing for their faculty. Right. And, people who were crouched in some two-story or two-room apartment, somewhere near Cambridge on a low salary, because it was such an honor to teach at Harvard that it didn't really matter if you got paid a living wage, flocked west. And
my father was a Columbia University professor, so we're all over that. But yes, Stanford's history, as well as Carmel's history, is defined by the railroad and railroad money. And and it is said the Stanfords went east and said to the president of Harvard, like, how much to do all this? He's like, well, it's not really matter. He goes, no, how much? And the guy gives him a number and he goes, we can do it.
Yeah, right. But since you asked me specifically about Monterey and Carmel, my roommate, or right in the freshman dorm, was from Monterey. Her family was from Monterey. Her father, in fact, owned the Mercedes dealership in Monterey, which is pretty nifty. And she had her own horse at Stanford, proving that the Mercedes people paid pretty well. And so I had an opportunity to visit the peninsula. And there are two ways. Well, if you wanted to drive from San Francisco, Palo Alto to Los Angeles, you had two choices back, and you probably still do. One of which is the Camino Real, which is kind of an inland way, which has been replaced by Interstate 5. But the other was that you would drive down south and then you would branch over, trying to remember exactly where, and you would take the Pacific Coast Highway, Highway 1, which was hazardous because sometimes it just fell into the sea, parts of it, and there was no way forward, so you had to retreat backward. But as a result, Monterey and Carmel were somewhat isolated. It wasn't all that easy to get there. And
Right.
Carmel is a lot. I mean, it's very, it was considered very bohemian then. Lots of artists, of different kinds, writers and artists, and there were a lot of cottages. I mean, it was a relatively small scale thing.
So when you see it today, you'll see what
yes.
are called the Hugh Comstock cottages, which were all in the 20s,
Yeah.
built around the 20s, and they're gorgeous. They look like they come out of a storybook.
They're
And so it's very-
yeah,
very
almost like Hansel and Gretel cottages.
Absolutely.
Little cottages.
So that's
And
what
very
people-
small businesses,
Yes.
very small, but excellent restaurants. And then there was the 17-mile drive, which I have to say, Catherine, is a knockout.
It's a knockout, and everyone should go see it. So I'm going to talk about Carmel's early history, when it came to be, and now it is a very affluent community, full of galleries, if not artists, because it's hard to actually live in Carmel on an artist salary anymore. But and absolutely a place people go on vacation. And I've joked that, when scientists have an ideal project in mind, they write a grant for the effects of champagne on lobsters, so they get to have both around a lot. And I felt like a research project into Carmel's history was the humanities equivalent, because I had to go to Carmel a lot.
Well, poor you, but I want to say that it really has upscaled, and
it's very upscale.
1958 wasn't that long ago,
right?
But it truly has upscaled in a way that I would not recognize as easily. And
Clint
Monterey,
Eastwood,
which was a cannery kind of a town. Cannery was a very working town. I mean, Steinbeck, all that. Monterey too has become far more upscale, but their piece of the California coast is magnificent and will always
gorgeous.
Be monetized.
Okay, I'm going to be able to show you some of that. I'm going to go to the presentation. So, as Barbara, you were just saying, it winds up being a little secluded, right? And that's to its benefit. It preserved its beauty, over the ages. And when you read books about Carmel today, it says it was founded in the early 20th century, and it talks about the Bohemians who wound up there when there was hardly anything there. And they just stumble upon this landscape and decide, here's a place where we can dwell, live off the earth, and create good art. And what I'm going to tell you is that story is a fabrication. And it has a lot to do with some of these events that happened. Okay, but before we get to Carmel proper, so at the time Carmel was founded, we are at the tail end, the edge of the Gilded Age. And we're entering a time of huge technological, industrial change, and also a time of huge social change. And there was an entity known as the New Woman. They talked about at the time, and historians still talk about today, and she sort of represented there reading the paper. She's not staying demurely at home. She's getting out there in the world. She will ride a bicycle. She might even publish something, and she might even try to vote, or be working towards that. Okay, so that was a real phenomenon. What I noticed, however, as I was doing this research at the time, you notice this illustration is copyrighted in 1901. So this is the year before Carmel is founded. there never was any mention of a new man. I mean, nobody talked about a new man. In fact, there wasn't a new man. So the guy on the right who's doing the laundry and everything while she's reading the paper, that actually never happened. One of the very commodified elements, though, of the New Woman was, and these might be familiar illustrations to people, they were in the magazines, which were exploding because women were reading. So you had the Ladies' Home Journal, you know, for example, and people were reading that. And so Charles Dana Gibson would do these illustrations of New Women called eventually the Gibson Girls after him. And they all have this sort of updo, you know, that was the big thing, a kind of blousey top, a cinched waist, like corset cinched, and then this long skirt, but almost more really kind of defining of the New Woman was the pose of assuredness, of confidence, of like, I can attract a man, but I know who I am. Okay, these are George and Carrie Sterling facing you. These are the Bohemians who supposedly started the settlement at Carmel. Now, Carrie Sterling, I want you to notice, is like a New Woman Gibson girl. She's got the updo, the blousey top, the, you know, cinched waist, and the long skirt. Now, she actually grew up really poor. There's two heroines in my book, and she's one of them. Her police captain dad dies in his 40s, leaving 5 children. And so through census records, I figured out that her mom moved closer to the Oakland docks, at that point a terminus for the Transcontinental Railway, and used her house for boarders, which meant that, you know, Carrie was helping out when she lived there with the boarders. Now, Carrie has had enough of being poor by the time she's, you know, 18, 19, and she decides she is going to marry and marry up. She's one of the early group of women to work in an office. She gets a job, and there she meets George Sterling, who she marries in short order. Who is George Sterling? He's talked a lot about in San Francisco. He was once the poet laureate of California. He has a whole park on Russian Hill, like, you know, dedicated to him. But who was he really? You know, so he is the protege of Ambrose Bierce and Jack London's best friend. He was known at the time as the King of Bohemia because he had all these artistic friends, and they would go to this big restaurant in San Francisco called Kappa's. They'd paint on the walls, they'd sketch people who were coming in, you know, and he would compose poetry and read it to people aloud. And so they basically ran that joint. Kappa's didn't have to have a dancing girl or an orchestra. They had the Bohemians, okay? He was also simultaneously a land developer. He was the bookkeeper and eventually the vice president of the Realty Syndicate, which was the second biggest land developer in the Bay Area. So you have this Pacific Improvement Company, which belonged to the Southern Pacific Railroad. And then you have the Realty Syndicate. And what they did was the syndicate bought up all this depressed farmland in Alameda, Oakland area, and Berkeley towards the hills, turned it into residential lots. So they wanted to make basically the suburbs and attract the wealthy people. And eventually the Piedmont, this is a map from one of their brochures, became known as a city of millionaires because of the wealth that settled there. In order to do that, to get people to move there, they had to move people across the bay quickly to work. And so the other thing they did was erect this 5,000 meter pier that went out towards Yerba Buena Island, which was at the time Goat Island, takes a left. And then the ferries to Market Street, where the financial district in San Francisco is, take off from there. So they shaved time off the commute and they made it viable. The other thing George Sterling, who started the Carmel Colony, had his hooks in was the Bohemian Club. The Bohemian Club was an early club where businessmen, and it's still very active, rubbed shoulders with artistic types. And they had a motto, "Weaving spiders come not here," which meant we don't do deals, we're devoted to art. And every summer they do 2 weeks in the Sonoma Hills out there by the Russian River. And that became kind of famous for a, you know, excess and debauchery time. But they also put on a play and did other things. So at that picture, you see Sterling In the middle, seated next to him, that's Jack London, who we took often to the Bohemian Club. And that's Porter Garnett, another friend who was in the arts. Okay, so Sterling came from money. He had money at the time he moved to Carmel. He didn't just decide to move to Carmel. Another figure who was a member of the Bohemian Club that people don't talk about much was Frank Powers, an attorney who bought this little red square mile of real estate. And Frank Powers tried everything to get people to move to that little square mile. Now, note where it is on the map. Monterey is up on top. The Southern Pacific Railroad comes right to Monterey. Next to that, the railroad company's land development arm did the sumptuous Hotel Del Monte, which has like 500 rooms, ornamental gardens, a paddle pond, a racetrack, bathhouses. So if you were wealthy in San Francisco in 1900, you could just take the train down for the weekend, get a place in Monterey, and then, have a great time and go back up. So Powers figured all he had to do, he thought, he was sure, they told him the railway would extend to Carmel. He's like, great, that'll triple this, but so he buys the land, but at the time he buys it, the 3 miles to Monterey is just a dirt track and a very uncomfortable ride. And so he had a lot of problems attracting people to it. This is a photograph that people always associate with early Carmel. Here we have the Bohemians, George Sterling, the supposed founder, Mary Austin next to him, who was a known woman writer, a new woman, writer of the American West. That's Jack London making some point over there. And next to him, Jimmy Hopper, another short story writer who becomes pivotal in the story. They are in front of one of the rare structures in Carmel, the bathhouse that was there when Powers bought it. And so this features in a lot of coffee table books is like, this is the moment the artists decide they want to move there. Sorry, I have to go one back, but this is how the picture was actually taken. It was very staged. Arnold Genta is in the foreground as a photographer, and people might remember him as the guy who took all the photos from the San Francisco earthquake. And they've just got Jack London down for the weekend. Jack London actually didn't buy into Carmel. He never spent more than a month there in his life, but this photo circulated everywhere, ensured that whenever Carmel was mentioned, Jack London would be mentioned in the same breath. I also want you to notice behind the log, how all the women are kind of like off to the side, right? They're kind of playing a supporting role, and Carrie's among them. And she is feeding and housing all these people who come through while her husband engages in a great time. Here's George Sterling, her husband, okay? This photo is in the Harrison Memorial Library, but I believe it was taken by Genta around the same time. That's an abalone shell in front of George Sterling. And abalone was very much part of George Sterling's selling point. So, you know how you buy a timeshare these days? Like somebody says, oh, there's this great property. It's really fun. Come on down. You just have to sit through 2 hours of spiel, right? And then, you'll have a great time otherwise. And they show you a good time and then they try to get you to buy. Well, this is exactly what George Sterling did. And he had a program that he took almost everyone through. He would pick them up in Monterey. He would take them to the Hotel Del Monte for lunch. He would then take them on the sumptuous 17-mile drive that was already carved out by the Pacific Improvement Company. Then he would put them up either at his house where Carrie had to take care of them or in the one hotel. And the next day they would all go to Point Lobos and he would strip down and swim for abalone. And the fun part was for all these people to like pound the abalone for an hour so it's tender enough for the grill. And then they could put it on the grill and eat it. And they would think up verses while they're pounding. And this one was in one of Jack London's book. Jack London wrote about Carmel a lot. They had a very reciprocal arrangement. Some folks boast of quail on toast because they think it's Tony, but I'm content to owe my rent and live on abalone. At the time he was singing that, he was vice president of the second biggest land development company in the East Bay. All right, now here we take a turn. Carmel supposedly ends the heyday anyway in a suicide cult where everybody takes cyanide. And the story is that all the Bohemians agreed at a certain point that to carry around cyanide on their person. So the minute that the love of life failed them, or they, were not the bon vivants, they could dispatch themselves quickly. So there are 3 cyanide deaths that are pertinent to the story. There's George Sterling up top. He dies of cyanide in the Bohemian Club, 1926. And this is not a spoiler, you can Google this. Carrie Sterling, his wife, 1918 in the Piedmont. And then Normae French, 1907, this poor woman who dies in the Sterling house and gets blamed for all of it, okay, because she goes first. So who was Normae French? Hold on a second. Here she is. Normae French was a very known poet, even when she died at the age of 26 in 1907. She had been publishing since the age of 11. She had published in every good journal in the West Coast and was publishing nationally. She published a story in the Saturday Evening Post that was on the cover. I actually have a copy of it here. You can't see it so well because of the blurring, but where she recounts her experience as working for the telephone company. She was gorgeous, and she had an interesting lineage. So on the left, you see Henry Wells, and on the right, Augustus French, the 9th governor of Illinois. She's the great grandniece of Wells. He started Wells Fargo and American Express. She's born in Aurora, which is a town that Wells as good as owns. But her father is also the son of the 9th governor of Illinois. And one of the problems I had when I was researching is, why did she wind up so poor? Her family moves to California and becomes destitute. And I was like, why didn't any of these people bail them out? And the answer is pretty riveting, but that is a spoiler, so I won't say it. But anyway, she is a new woman, but she rejects the Gibson girl thing entirely. Her hair is always a mess, as she put it. She does not wear corsets. She does not cinch her waist. She has a good hiking skirt because she loves to be outdoors. So she doesn't wear a skirt that goes all the way down to the bottom often. She probably made those leather gaiters when she was working in LA as a seamstress in a leather factory for $5 a week. Okay, but she is a true, unlike the others, true Bohemian nature spirit. And she would go out and camp by herself. She just loved to be outside. She had a weak spot, men. Okay, here we have a picture after the earthquake. Sometime she winds up publishing a story with the journal this gentleman, Harry Laffler, edits. And they fall in love through the mail. And she decides to move to San Francisco to be with him after the earthquake, which pretty much leveled the town. So that's a pretty ballsy thing right there. But what I'm going to say about Harry Laffler is you can see that trench next to him going, past him, and the shovel. That is a mass grave. It is just a couple of days after the earthquake. And you've got to imagine what kind of man could sit there and type, that's his typewriter, for hours and hours and hours and hours next to a mass grave. He's an interesting fella. So here is the letter that changed my project. It is by Normae French, and it is in the Bancroft Library in Berkeley. It is to Harry Laffler after she has moved to San Francisco, and it is about an abortion that she is having. She went and bought pills, and she's writing to him while she's having it. Now, you can learn a lot from archival documents. One thing I noticed immediately is Bohemian Club Stationery was probably Harry's. He was also a member of the Bohemian Club. But also, this looks like none of her other letters because the handwriting is just more irregular. It looks like she's almost pressing the paper at point. She's in the pain that she describes. And that's the point where my project really started to focus in on the women, especially as the letter, unlike all her other letters in Harry Laffler's collection. So this is Laffler's collection, not hers, but her letters are in it. This one was missing a page. And I always wonder, what did they not want us to find out? And it became a pattern in all these letters I found with George Sterling to Ambrose Bierce or about or from Normae French, that they had been ripped or words about Normae French had been scratched out. And the more I saw how hard the men worked to kind of like shape a story about her, the more I got curious. Okay, this is the last slide I'll show, and then we can discuss. When she dies in the Sterling house, Carrie is the only person at home. Okay, and there's a news report about it. Because Normae French was gorgeous, and the newspapers loved nothing more than a gorgeous girl's death, you know, they give it the front page. And there's 5 more pages about it. And I read about her death in about 30 different newspapers, all speculating, you know, why she, you know, decided to kill herself in the Sterling household at the tender age of 26. You see, there's some of her poetry, there's a picture of George Sterling there, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that was interesting as I was writing this book, people were like, why are you writing about these unknown women when the men were more famous? And I was like, by this point, I'd been staring at their faces and front pages of newspapers for quite some time. And I thought, what unknown women? They were known at the time. But over history, you know, it's like one does not die an unknown woman, one becomes so over time. Their legacy got erased. So people, you know, if they hear about Normae French at all, it's about the Cyanide cult, when in fact, she was a much better poet than George Sterling, who winds up with all the accolades. Just the last screen to say thank you. Thank you, Poison Pen, for having me. I am eager to hear your questions, and you can see more at my website if anybody wants to follow up. So, all right, Barbara, I'm ready for you.
Well, I was really, you know, as I say, fairly naive about this. It wasn't a focus of my life. I'm glad to say that when I said I thought of Carmel as Bohemian, that actually that was a relatively, that impression of it was still true.
Yes, yeah.
Right, 40 years later than when you're writing about. But I had no idea about this whole land development thing, and you describe it really well. And looking at page 76 and 77, George Sterling, in the spring of 1905, you say, had signed on to be the anchor of the writing colony. And the writing colony is, I gather, something that Frank Powers of the Pacific Improvement Company.
Oh, no, he's the rival to the Pacific Improvement Company. Improvement Company has Monterey.
Right. Okay. If they would give Carmel Development Company 500 acres of land on their shared border, he would lure a group of writers to move to Carmel. And he would have those people write to their friends and publish stories and poems and literary journals about the beauty of the area. So, I mean, basically, it's a marketing thing.
It is absolutely a marketing thing. And I think one of the tougher things when I went to Carmel, it's always hard to talk to Carmel at Carmel about like the history. And I want to be clear, this is not the only story about Carmel. It's what the archival documents tell us. And when I went to the Carmel Library to do the research, she's like, nobody asked to see the corporate records of the Carmel Development Company, but that's where this trail was. There was the meeting minutes and the stockholder, you know, reports and the, you know, who sold what to whom. And this letter where he describes starting this idea. Now, it wasn't his first idea to sell the land. He also, and I didn't mention this in the book, I could have written an entire another book about the forensics accounting around it, but he was really broke at this time. It's 3 years after, and he's got nothing to show for it, really. And he tried to turn a factory, the sand into bricks. He was going to make bricks out of the sand. That was another thing he was thinking of doing with the money. So if you think about it, like you're thinking, oh, here's someone who wants to maximize the beauty of the area. I mean, he did plant a lot of trees, but he was really thinking out of the box for how to make money. And it wasn't his first, second, or third idea to lure Bohemians there.
Well, I assumed, as probably most people do, that the reason there was this kind of concentration of artists and writers and so forth in Carmel was they were drawn there by the, the rugged beauty of the coast, and the, relatively benign climate, because it is reasonably benign, and possibly the isolation of it, because as I mentioned earlier, it's not that easy to get to. Sort of the dynamic that, to some degree has gone on during the pandemic, where people have, thought about moving to more rural, less accessible places and all. But anyway, I just assumed that it was the glories of Carmel that had gotten people there. And
so the problem at the time, Barbara, you're right, but the problem at the time is the way that railways developed was, they sometimes made a railway to nowhere just because they wanted to sell securities that were based on the railway companies. Right. So the way land developed was really strange, and if you wanted to be in a remote area of California in 1902, you were spoiled for choice. There was really a lot of beauty. And so the question is, why would people move to this 1 square mile instead of somewhere else? And that's why they had competition, and some people came and visited, but decided to buy into Pasadena instead, or Chatsworth, or here or there. So they really had to compete. And you see George writing these letters to his friends going, all right, you don't want to move here, but I think this land will rise in value. Tell me right away if you'll buy it, because it'll go real fast, and the crassness of the sale is shocking when we think about, the myth of just people wanted to move here. People unfortunately didn't immediately. And that was a problem for those who had invested heavily.
Well, they certainly created a myth as well as an environment. Of course, Monterey Bay is a beautiful bay. Carmel Bay is much, much smaller, but I mean, it had Monterey Bay, had economic, it's a great fishing place. I mean, if you go today, the aquarium is the thing to do in Monterey. I mean, the aquarium is just a heart stopper. But, it was a very much a working class fishing community as far as the bay goes. So it's interesting that the railroad was coming in from the land side rather than the seaside. San Francisco was a notable port, but Monterey and Carmel were not. Never, why do people today, I read today, for example, that somebody's done a study about great retirement communities. Arizona, I'm happy to say, has crashed to the bottom. I'm so delighted because we're running out of water. So I'm going, yay.
Yeah, you're done.
But Florida, is like right up there on the top. And a lot of that is because of the recreational opportunities that, all that coast. Of course, one day, all that coast is going to be underwater, but nobody's thinking that far ahead.
Sure.
But that was not the dynamic that brought people to Carmel and Monterey, despite the wonderful.
It wasn't enough. And if you think about the Southern Pacific Railroad, they put the Hotel de Monte there and invested heavily and had the railroad. So you would get out of an express train from San Francisco under a hotel portico. This was set up. This was beautiful. But if you wanted to go that extra 3 miles to Carmel, you were on a horse and buggy. That was very uncomfortable and took an hour or more.
Well, I'm happy to tell you that my first trip to Arizona in 1950, you had to drive to today when you left Terminal 1 at the airport and you wanted to go to the Camelback Inn, you did it in a buckboard. And that was in 1950. There were only 2 paved roads in Scottsdale in 1950. It wasn't even incorporated. And today Scottsdale is knocking Beverly Hills sort of, on the shoulder. And it hasn't taken that long. So Arizona too has had the same sort of amazing growth.
So Carmel benefited from Yeah, Carmel benefited from the earthquake of 1906 because suddenly these people who were comfortable in San Francisco are no longer comfortable in San
Right.
Francisco. So, a bunch of people came, but not enough bought and stayed to make it worthwhile investing in artists as a draw. Now, you have to think of these bohemian artists as what today people would call influencers. Their job was to be seen having a good time, right?
Right.
But not a scandalous time. So, when Normae French dies in their house, that's a problem,
It is a
So, yeah,
problem. And, I think you wrote about, her self-administered abortion and,
yeah.
taking stuff like pennyroyal was extremely chancy. I mean, if you're a Poldark fan, for example, you will
Mhm.
know that Elizabeth, who, it tries to induce um, or induces, in fact, early childbirth for reasons I won't go into, and
Right,
overdoses on one of these abortifacients and dies from it. So
exactly.
it
And
was,
that's very real.
yeah, no, it was tremendously risky. So here, and it's this is her second abortion, Nora's second
Yes,
abortion, you say, not her first one, but
both by
obviously
married men.
birth control was obviously not much of a thing.
Yeah, I mean, it was unreliable.
Right.
And we have to go back to a time when one of the things I think I noticed about this letter is, wow, this is really strange to have this, because I have a colleague here who studies abortion history. We always know, abortion history has been going on for, centuries and centuries. And asked her, I said, so how many first person accounts do we have of going through an abortion from the woman's point of view around, early 1900s? And she said, hardly any.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so I realized, wow, I'm lucky to be reading this at all from a historian standpoint, because we know so much of attempts to legislate and everything, but everything about women's reproductive lives that fell outside the very narrow spectrum of you get married, then you have kids. Everything else, which was going on then as now, was scandalous. So
Yeah, it was scandalous, but it also occurred to me, reading the letter, she must have had PTSD of some sort, I mean, to go through that experience, not once, but twice. I mean,
yeah,
she dies at 26, right? So something really has derailed her life.
yeah,
And
and
I'm
that's
wondering if
something
those experiences were part of that.
that's something starts earlier than that, even with decisions her father made. And so she is under a dark star, but creating this illuminating poetry about, she's able to spin all her sorrows into very raw and compelling poetry along the way that gets published. And she has her periodic dark periods that she admits to, but she says, I often have my joys, which are much more enduring. The thing is, after she dies, they kind of make it as if she's always been depressed, like there was never any upside. And so you get a very sanitized version of her. One of the things I noticed in the reports of her death, which were nationwide, and as you find out in the book, spans copycat suicides as far away as New York, where people are found having killed themselves with a poem in her pocket, one of her poems in their pocket. But one of the things I found fascinating about this coverage is nobody mentions she's the grandchild of the governor of Illinois. Nobody mentions she's Henry Wells's grandniece. And this is at a time when America is up in arms against robber barons, because 1907 was the hugest crash up until the Great Depression. And any inkling of, depravity in corporate families' lives was all over the papers. And they kept those families well out.
Well, suicide, I don't want to say cults, but clusters of suicides can attach to all sorts of things. And, I remember spending an entire quarter at Stanford reading Goethe,
Oh,
essentially. And
yes.
while we were reading Faust, being an opera fan, I have seen the sorrows of young Werther more than
Yes.
once. And Werther is part of this whole romantic thing. And, he's a suicide for love.
Yep. So I talk about that in the book as well, because he's it's definitely the touch point. You know, you get these kind of like suicide crazes, and young men would show up at poor Goethe's house going like, "I'm gonna kill myself because of love." And he's like, "Just don't." You know, I'm sorry I ever wrote that. Yeah. So that's assumed to be the case, but the truth is there's no nothing except for one person's, the wife of one of the artists in Carmel, who says everyone carried suicide on their person. I couldn't find anything that suggested anything like that coordination. And the truth of what happened to people is far more sad and sordid and intimate and revealing of the gender relations than anything else. I do think the death of Normae French was a horrible thing that happened that the people around her never got over in one way or another. And I do think that this was a group of people who were having an alternative lifestyle outside the mainstream, extremely close-knit, everyone sleeping with one another, you know, really attached to their own myths. And when the horrible things happened, it really didn't, the reverberations were sometimes a year or even decades later. So much of the book takes place even after Normae French dies.
So do you see parallels here between Normae French and Sylvia Plath?
Absolutely, yeah. So except that, you know, Normae French wasn't old enough to write more, which is really horrifying. But yeah, there's ways in which we're learning a lot more about Sylvia Plath outside of what her, you know, ex-husband was saying, and the people who survived her, who had a stake in how we viewed her death and her life and her poems. So it's
with artists, you know, and they it's true that people do. I hadn't even thought about that, because I had a really interesting discussion the other day with a different author where Caravaggio and painting is a big thing. And so we got off into a whole thing about Caravaggio and also Christopher Marlowe. And, you know, you're right. I think when people have, you know, lives that are so explosive, so out of the norm, and whatever happens to them, because Caravaggio and Christopher Marlowe died very young, and, you know, in terrible circumstances. They probably both of them murdered and, you know, sorted, et cetera, if because they are artists, and, you know, we have expectations of them, but we also have, in the case of writers, their voices, or in the case of artists, you know, their visual voice, that we attach significance to that, and it has a much greater effect than if it had been just, you know, some other, you know, a not artist person who was either murdered or died and nobody had a stake. And also artistic legacy has lots of stakeholders: economic, emotional, philosophical. And so we tend to invest their lives and deaths with a lot more than we would a person who maybe was just like a business person, or, you know.
Yeah, you know, so both Harry Laffler and George Sterling were land developers. Eventually Harry Laffler was as well. And they were the editors of the volume, the posthumously published volume of Normae French's poetry after her death. Against her family's wishes, she had well left Laffler by that point. And so they really move in to kind of like capitalize on her poetry. And, you know, as they say, they use you alive and they use you dead, and they definitely did with her.
So did you, I don't know spoilers here, but so don't answer it specifically, but did you find a reason that satisfies you for her suicide, or is it largely inexplicable?
So I actually will never say what I think happened that night. I don't want people to come to their own conclusions and have knockdown dragouts. What I do say in the book is the reports of her death are literally unbelievable. Like, they're literally don't add up. They don't make sense in any way, and disturbed me, you know, greatly when I was reading them. But the two people closest to the book, I would say, who've read it the most, my agent and my editor, they have two different reads on what happened that night.
Well, let's move on to Carrie and George. I mean, because all three of them die from suicide. Do you think there's a causal connection, is it like dominoes, or do you want to share that maybe you'd rather people read the book and discovered it?
I will say that it's all related to what happened the night Nora died.
Okay. And should we get some sort of picture in the book of what happened?
Oh, yeah.
I was trying to drag it out of her, people.
Yeah, right. So, but what, the way I wrote this book, Barbara, to be honest, I wanted to take people with me in the archives and to look at the evidence that I have. It's not a complete picture. And with women's lives, we often don't get a complete picture because, as I mentioned, the records are usually preserved around men. Normae French's have been altered a lot. The newspapers lied. These people lied to the newspapers, each other, and George Sterling even lied to his own diary, which I discuss. They really, you have to triangulate, I would just triangulate all sorts of sources to figure out. So, there's moments where the reader is going to have to come to their own conclusion.
Well, and this is a term that is
fun. It should be fun.
Well, it is, but I'm going to go back to your opening remarks because this is a term that has come into vogue, and in a way, it's sort of oxymoronic. But narrative nonfiction, I love that. But basically, what it means is that you're taking real things, real events, and you are storytelling. You are using those as, and so what you wind up with is nonfiction that reads like a novel. And inevitably, in order to do that you interpolate things into what's known. And
there are moments like that.
We can't know for sure
yeah.
about seminal events, and I mean about not the seminal events, but the interstices that occur in those events in people's lives. So the biographer interprets them, right?
Yes. So what I did was
the truth, and that's what you're doing in this
book.
So
the only difference is at key moments, I say, I'm interpreting here. I mean, I don't know what you think this means, but this is what I think. So, I kind of invite that. And I like that because I like archives. I like the experience of discovery, of being in them. And I want people to have that discovery experience rather than me wrapping up the tale and saying, this is how it went. Because there are some things where I'm not sure. But I did have to come to a moment where I was like, okay, either we just keep telling the same stories about men over and over again, because that's where the records are. There's tons of records about Jack London, 66,000 in the Huntington alone, so we could write endless books about Jack London. But if we're going to get the woman's perspective, there's going to be more gaps. And we have to do our level best to connect the dots and be clear when we're connecting.
Well, you have to bring some of the novelist skill set along, but you also have to bring an investigator's skill set along, because, really what you're doing is working a cold case here.
I am.
You're following the evidence, you're doing the research and all, and you're coming up with, this could be Michael Connelly, or it could be
exactly. It is totally a cold case. You nailed it. It's a cold case.
No, it's really fascinating. I had marked something else, damn it, and now I lost my. But one of the things when you were talking about the new women, I think it's way very back at the beginning. You were talking about books that were being written at this time. In which women were the heroines. I wish I hadn't pulled my
I know. Yes.
And the D'Urberville, stuff like that. So I thought that was part of what was happening at the turn of the 20th century is that
absolutely. Carrie Sterling and Normae French are like the real life heroines in those books. And like those real life heroines, real women at the time bore all the consequences of the loosening of sexual codes going on in these bohemian environments. And so, in those novels, as my colleague Stephanie Foote would point out, women get to go and do new things, but at the end, they're always punished for it.
I still sort of, have a little bit of a whatever when I read so casually about, hookup sites and so forth, because, reliable birth control didn't really come into play until I was in my 20s. And one of the worst things that could happen to you was to get pregnant, when you didn't even know how to chart your life's course. And all of a sudden there you might be with the responsibility of a child, or the painful decision to have an illegal abortion, or whatever it is.
And we still
might
barely
do.
talk about it.
But, once we got to really reliable contraception, whether it was an IUD or whatever it all is, then sexual freedom for women became really on a par with sexual freedom for men. And now, as I say, you have hookup sites, where people can, and I mean, to me, this is still something of a foreign language, but
I am old enough where I predate the swipe left, swipe right.
yeah, well, I mean, I'm probably never going to swipe right, because I've been married now to this husband for 30 years, 31 years coming up, and at 80 I probably don't care anyway.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Nonetheless,
they were swiping right and left back then, but just when it went wrong really bad for the women.
Absolutely, it's the same thing. Obviously, for Nora, she obviously swiped right twice, and but she ended up with with life-changing, certainly psyche-changing consequences.
But even beyond abortion, there's another friend of theirs who dies of uremia in pregnancy, and there's another Charmy in London had a terrible birth. Their kid dies in 3 days, and the surgeon butchered her uterus, that she's never able to have another child. So all of this is sort of humming along in the background, that whether this went well or not. And Carrie is from the beginning like, I want no part of that, because she can tell, like, you engage in reproduction, you die early or live miserably, from what she saw. So she's constantly like, why would even Charmian try to have another kid? That's crazy.
Well, we don't think of childbirth today as being nearly as risky as it was. I mean, people used to die of what was called puerperal or childbed fever. And, it was propagated because people went from birth to birth. Midwives all didn't bother to wash their hands because people didn't know about germ theory. Queen Victoria pioneered the use of ether as an anesthesia during really painful childbirth. But, up until then, anytime a woman got pregnant, you were rolling the dice.
I had 45 hours of labor. I would have died.
I mean, it was a really dreadful thing. If you watched, say you watched Downton Abbey, and you discovered, when the younger daughter, the middle daughter, I guess it is, dies, maybe she was the younger one, in pregnancy, is because, I'm trying to remember, eclampsia. Nobody knew what to do anything about that.
Exactly. And that's that. There's no, they lived far enough from doctors that they didn't go, or doctors were expensive, so they didn't feel like they could go.
100 years ago, in the scheme of things, is not that long ago. So we're very fortunate that modern medicine has made pregnancy and childbirth. And I'm not going to go into abortion politics, but I do think that it's wonderful that women have much more control over their lives as a result of having more control over reproduction.
So this is where I end the book a bit. There is a figure who comes out of Carmel, a young woman who then goes on to become one of the greatest muckrakers, I think, of last century, pursuing juvenile justice issues, women's, she gets a letter from Planned Parenthood, which at the time is a very early organization. And she really gets it, that women have to, have some sort of freedom and rights about this. And it's a shame. Her name was Vera Connolly, and somebody should take that baton and write a book about her, because she was amazing.
Well, maybe it will be you. So I see we're coming up on the hour, and I need to get Patrick back to see if we have any questions. But I want to say that really this book reads with the force of a novel. It's really true crime, but you get to look at all sorts of things. You get to look at new women, the changing roles of women. You get to look at land development and speculation. You get to look at railroads and other sorts of, economic drivers. You get to look at suicide and other stuff, and you get to hang out with some well-known writers like, say, Jack London, that you might not have expected. So it's really an amazing book.
Thank you.
Which I highly recommend. Patrick, come join us. And if you're not completely stupefied, do you have any comments or questions?
completely stupefied. This is fascinating stuff. Yeah. Well, I think the audience might be stupefied though. I don't see any real questions
That's
coming
fine.
in.
That's all right. They will develop as people watch and listen to this.
It's funny because I've been reading little samples throughout the text while you guys have been talking,
Yeah.
and I really admire the style, the way you've approached. Because often one of my gripes with the whole narrative nonfiction thing or approach, and also some true crime, is when the author will lapse into, Sam must have been thinking about his, the upcoming fall, like putting thoughts into the characters' minds that were completely invented. And I like how you stick to the facts and stitch it together.
I won't say that I don't, so the thing is, I didn't want to do the must-haves, one thing.
Right,
At the times that we're wandering in Carrie's or Nora's minds, it's always got some root in some letter where they've expressed something so all of that prologue, for example, when she's describing how she thinks and I kind of narrate it through, if you read the whole letter, you'll see all those things that she's saying. So I just trying to weave it into a more readable way.
With all these factual touchstones along the way. Yeah.
So, and that's the other thing. I mean, I think one of the cautions that came out of my research is don't just believe the newspapers. Don't even just believe the letters. You really have to get several points of view before you can write a scene and get an understanding of what the different biases were in representing what happened.
Well, William Randolph Hearst was very much a presence by this time, wasn't he?
Well, yeah, he hired Ambrose Bierce to go and write about the railroads lobbying government. And that's what took Bierce out of the Bay Area to DC. Bierce at that point had called, what do you call C.P. Huntington? 36 of the surviving 40 thieves, because at that point Stanford had died and the other guy had died. Yeah,
the robber barons, right?
Yeah, the robber barons. So he and George, there's a ton of correspondence between him and George Sterling, because he's assured George Sterling that he's like the next Keats. So this is part of why George wants to move to Carmel. He's convinced he can live on his poetry, which he can't. But Bierce tells him he's the greatest thing since sliced bread, and he believes it. And he's not, actually. And he was acknowledged as not at the time. There were terrible reviews of his work.
And wasn't Bierce the one who disappeared down in Mexico?
Yeah,
yes, he
absolutely.
did.
He's been the subject of a number of both nonfiction and fictional treatments of what happened. Nobody knows for sure what happened.
Nobody knows. And George, in fact, takes on critics for Bierce all the time. And there are many. Bierce was a very polarizing figure, and George carries his, flag. But after Bierce's death, he says he did not kill himself. He would never do that. So yeah.
He becomes B. Traven. No.
Yeah.
Probably not.
No, he does write to his niece Laura. He's like, if I'm shot up against a wall by Mexicans, that's a good way to go. Don't mourn. If I'm shot to rags against the wall, so he says, I don't care if I die there. And people took that as a suicide note. So George is like, oh no, my mentor would never commit suicide. Whereas for Nora, they're working overtime to make sure everybody knows that she was suicidal every minute of her life.
Well, they've clearly never heard about suicide by cop then, or people who put themselves into situations. So in fact, they force other people to kill them, which really is suicide.
Yeah, it's true. That's a good point. Yeah. So Bierce is a big figure. Jack London is a big figure. And Jack London is the reason a lot of these people burn their letters, because they instruct each other often to burn letters after they write them. Obviously, they didn't, or I wouldn't read it. But when George Sterling is discovered in the Bohemian Club, there's a pile of ash on his desk. He burned his letters before he killed himself. And Bierce wrote to him, everyone should burn their letters. It's the only way to go. They were very conscious, and particularly because Jack London had been savaged in the news after his marriage broke up and he chose to marry Charmian instead. So always so careful.
London packed a lot into his, was it 40 years, 41 years, something like that?
Yes, he did. Yeah, and he's kind of on the sidelines of this text But the frenemy relationship between Carrie Sterling and Sharmy in London was delightful to find,
Frenemy.
yeah, that runs throughout the book. They are just like frenemies of 100 years ago. It's great.
Did they seem very contemporary when you were writing about them?
Oh my gosh, yes. I recognize these women immediately. And, Nora first, because I have a lot of clever friends, and her voice as a writer was just so clear in her letters. Carrie took me a little longer to kind of relate to, but my uncle, who unfortunately died in 2020, was reading an early draft of it. And she turned out to be the only one he liked. And I realized, oh my gosh, my grandmother, my uncle's mom, grew up in an Irish industrial school, immigrated to the United States at the age of 18, and was like, I'm not going to be married to just some pauper. I'm going to marry up. Did not glamorize poverty. She had TB and everything. She was just like, no. And she would have had no patience with this crowd whatsoever. So all of a sudden I could see Carrie's eye rolling, through a different lens.
Wow. Can you talk? I was reading a little bit about your academic work, and
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about that, and also what sort of courses do you teach?
Okay, so I was thinking this was a huge departure for me, but it was funny when the Wall Street Journal review came out and said, tenacious research with humorous asides. One of my colleagues in the field said, oh, that's you. It's in every article. And I always have had this voice that comes through articles that sometimes in grad school, they're like, you write a little too well. Like that's a problem in academia. But I definitely did a lot of archival work, and that comes through in this. When I teach qualitative methods, I like wear the house t-shirt, everybody lies, because I want everybody to triangulate their data, whether they're interviewing someone or they've got an artifact or something. And so I'm no stranger to the archives or trying to find, truth in very disparate accounts. And I'm always listening for, I feel like truth is sometimes comes through the gaps, that thing that people stop or they pause or they make a joke out of rather than finish the thought. Like to me, those are always the most revealing moments. So when I was going through the letters, that's where I went.
I'm thinking that perhaps academic writing does not encourage the writer to be engaging.
Not so much,
to have
no.
your own voice. Well, no, I'm serious.
I'm serious too. Yeah, no, it doesn't. And eventually I was like, well, I could write another monograph or I could do something different. And I feel as a professor that if we in the humanities cannot engage the public in the findings of our research, we're doomed. We need to speak outside of our, ivory towers. And so I really wanted to make sure that happened. Now, it was not a flick of the switch. Trade publishing is not the same as academic publishing. I learned a lot about it. And now I teach a course that a lot of creative writers take about how to send your work out there and, look for, opportunities. It's called Writing for Money. So I've used this sort of experience in the teaching.
Do you get to teach any lit courses at your level?
Yeah, right now I'm teaching, what am I teaching right now? Last semester I taught disability in literature. So we read Oedipus, Jane Eyre, all kinds of stuff where disability figures prominently.
Christy Brown.
Christy Brown?
Wasn't it Christy Brown who wrote My Left Foot?
Oh yeah, no, we are with the classics. Like this is things that would appear on a Victorian syllabus or something, but we're focusing on disability. So Oedipus with his lame foot. And that's the reason he solves the Sphinx riddle, and Tiresias, the blind prophet. So the disability is riven throughout literature. And yeah, Ahab. If I didn't hate Moby Dick, I'd teach that one.
I'm a recovering English major, so.
Oh yeah, I'm. At least you're recovering.
Yeah. Recovered, hopefully.
Recovered, yes.
Yeah.
No, I love it. And right now I'm teaching a little film and a little critical theory. And, I have an immense freedom in my job and I'm very glad for it. But this really was a departure for me. And I'm going to write more books like this. I really enjoy it.
Well, wonderful, because I think you've done a marvelous job. I was totally engaged from start to finish, and I learned many things. So, it's hard to beat that recipe. I've always thought that people who read crime fiction do it in part to learn stuff, because you do
Yes,
inevitably in any really good mystery, you always learn things. And
that's
so
so right. It's
it's a
about the scene.
continual, it's a continual learning process. And so you wind up with people like Patrick and me. We have these kind of ragbag, minds just filled with all kinds of stuff that the
Right.
ordinary person. I know how to deflence a body. I'm not ever going to do it, but I know how. And
Or
that kind
Nero
of thing.
Wolf. You learn a lot about orchids while you're doing it.
Good. Yep,
They're
tries
also
the basic
interesting.
ingredient.
They're also interesting time capsules, depending upon what
Yes.
you're reading. And so you can
Well,
see
they
what's
are,
going
but
on.
it also, I really believe it's true. Somebody wrote about crime fiction, which I've often said that the best of it it cuts along the edge of social change, because you're looking for conflict. You're looking for reasons for people to kill, and people to commit crimes and so forth. And I do think that crime fiction is very good at exploring social change as we move along.
You've just explained me to me. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I've read 2 or 3 books recently by writers who I have to assume are under 40, and it's almost as though I'm stepping into a whole new dimension. And that's how I know about hookups and swiping right, because it's not part of my own experience.
Yeah,
But,
crime is harder when you've got cell phones.
Right, but I'm really fascinated with it, and I think it's important to keep up, so to speak, and it's a reading crime fiction or is a wonderful way to do that. There are many parallels in your book between the time then and the time now.
Yes.
Many parallels, and so if we hope that learning the past informs us in the present. That's a wonderful thing. This has been wonderful, Catherine. Thank you for your
Yes,
time and for the wonderful slideshow. That was really beautifully done.
Thank you. I had all these photographs. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to show it. And I really have enjoyed this talk, Barbara and Patrick. So thanks for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure indeed. I will send you links. There will be, oh, right. We have our signed book place for anyone who wants to. And I mean, this is a book you could actually give to any reader, since we're coming up to the gift giving season. And I'm going to repeat that October is the new December, and for sure November is the new December, because the supply and shipping systems are in total disarray. So
Yes.
Think about it right now. There will be a podcast available, and the video is going to live on forever on Facebook and YouTube on our channels. So please recommend to people you think would enjoy it. They have an opportunity to listen or to visit. Right. So good night, everyone. Thank you very much, Catherine.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thanks for listening.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.